הניסים ועל הברכן ועל הגבורות ועל התשועות ועל הנפלאות, על הניסים ועל הברכן ועל הגבורות ועל התשועות ועל הנפלאות שעשית לאבותינו בימים ההם בזמן הזה, בזמן הזה שעשית לאבותינו בימים ההם בזמן הזה.
Welcome to Jewish Life, a program presented in cooperation with the Jewish Relations Council of New York. I'm your host, Stewart Ain. Every week we present programs of particular interest to the Jewish community. Today I'd like to welcome back Rabbi Abraham Cooper. He's the Associate Dean and Director of Global Social Action at the Simon Wiesenthal Center in Los Angeles. Welcome back again. Good to see you. I thought we talked today. Great. I thought we talked today about this crazy rise in anti-Semitism worldwide, as well as some developments in Israel. And I see the Wiesenthal Center is taking positions on both of these issues, particularly what's going on in Israel. But, you know, what we've seen, we're in the beginning of August now, in 2025, and I've seen a number of countries, France and Great Britain, and they're saying, well, they're going to recognize a Palestinian state. And I see that the Wiesenthal Center has said, basically, you know, you're caving into the demands of Hamas.
I think that's pretty clear in the case, certainly of France and the UK, and there are other countries. Australia would be an important example. There are a lot of moving parts to this, but I think the most important element of what's quote unquote change is the fact that there are significant Muslim and Arab constituencies in each of these countries. And certainly in the case of France, UK, Australia, that there have been essentially pro-Hamas open activities in London, a place where there's a significant Jewish community, but also, you know, many Jewish tourists, etc. You now read about attacks on people who are eating at a kosher restaurant. This is a phenomenon which we're experiencing also here in New York and in Los Angeles. We're experiencing it increasingly across the United States. Canada is also in the other camp, in which the political realities of the day to those who are in charge encourage them to make moves on the world stage that would curry favor with a significant and growing population of Muslims and Arabs in their own countries. So, especially for someone like Stammer, his statement in some ways is the most, I would call it, lurid of all. He's demanding that Israel essentially surrender, declare a ceasefire, which is another way for dictating a cave, with no real guarantees that the hostages, the dead and the living, would be returned, and that the Palestinians would be granted their quote unquote inalienable rights to have a state. And of course, the fundamental questions that have, you know, when we were actually close to having treaties years ago, was who is going to run the Palestinian side of things? Last time I checked, there's no Gandhi, there's no Martin Luther King Jr. What we have is Hamas mass murderers who've killed in one day, as we know, the largest number of Jews in the most horrific way since the Shoah. And we have a Palestinian Authority. I think the president is now in the 17th or 18th year of his 4-year term, still was afraid to ever show up in Gaza because it was controlled by Hamas, and who has embedded into the Palestinian law the pay to slay rule, So that means all of those people that we've seen boast of their rapes, their tortures, their burning kids alive, families, all of their families have the right to be rewarded financially forever through the Palestinian Authority. So never mind the details. You have someone who's in 10 Downing Street who forgot to read some of Churchill's most famous quotes about appeasement and crocodiles. And I think Keith Starmer better be, watching over his back, because the crocodiles of appeasement are coming very, very close, but not only to him. I think insofar as Macron, who's led the day and led the way in a lot of ways, I think he's an extremely frustrated leader. In many ways, he is sidelined by President Trump's dynamic interventions. Just think, for example, about Syria, a place I happened to have visited a few weeks ago and met with the new president. That historically, over the last, 100 plus years, Syria, Lebanon, it's basically been French, quote unquote, influence, historic influence. Right now, you never hear the name Macron
No,
discussed, because Trump made whatever move that he made as far as to bring those leaders into his camp. Domestically, Macron has failed to fully deploy all aspects of French government in attacking and defeating anti-Semitism. The police, I just saw that the finally having a trial in the Joe Goldenberg killings from the early 1980s, finally starting now. So the French police have generally done a better job. The Ministry of Interior has done a better job over the last decade. But then we have problems that no judge would sentence even murderers of Jews if they came from Africa. They were basically let go, or a slap on the wrist. So you now have on the streets of Toulouse, where you had Nebuch, the rabbi, young rabbi, and two kids coming to day school, murdered in Toulouse. You now have the celebration of those murders by local Islamists. So the situation in France, in insofar of as the most important and largest Jewish community in Western Europe, is basically out of control. And the idea that Macron could wag his finger at Israel and saying, we're going to do this, that, and the other thing, is enraging, outrageous, and doesn't deserve our respect. It deserves, I hope it will get wall-to-wall condemnation, not only from Jewish leaders in the United States, but from the US itself, because we're seeing the domino effects of these comments, going to more and more nations. I think we're going to have a particularly painful General Assembly coming up in a
New
few
York,
weeks.
yeah, September.
And I think that the long range goal, unfortunately, and I hope and pray that I am wrong, but the long range goal now is beginning to become very clear. And that is one move after another with the Francesca Albanese's and with the United Nations Human Rights Council, and with the High Commissioner for Refugees, and special rapporteurs who are supposed to be protecting women and children who refuse to stand up for Israeli women and children. Where we're heading is a serious effort to throw Israel out of the UN altogether. It's not going to happen in a day, but I may not be particularly bright, but I've been around a while, and I'm watching where the momentum is going. So on the global end of things, perhaps when Israel writes the final chapter in Gaza, and it'll become the day after, we'll have a whole set of other challenges. I think maybe we can see hopefully the beginning of the defeat, or at least the counterattack against Hamas's successful war. They've successfully exported their genocidal agenda, and it has been absorbed and adopted by the media, by many in academia, etc.
But the Arab League, in an unprecedented move, has now called for Hamas to disarm and transfer control in Gaza to the Palestinian Authority. I know your organization, the Simon Wiesenthal Center, has hailed this move. That's one of the bright lights that come out of this.
Yeah, it's true. We commended it. I think also in our statement, we put in another sentence, which I don't know that the Arab League is ready to enunciate, but it's great to make that declaration. The other part of the declaration that hopefully will come is that no Hamas member will ever be able to be part of Palestinian governance. Because look, we saw with UNRWA, Hamas taking off its uniform, going into UNRWA locations, finishing a day at work, and then going back underneath the ground to prepare their slaughter of Jews. So I'm not, of course, not minimizing it, but also you're actually touching on, I think, a much more profound point. As you watch the European and the Australasia nations and Finland, etc., making that move, you don't hear anything from the Arab countries. That's because the Arab nations, the people who govern them, want Israel to defeat Hamas. And just as they quietly applauded the downgrading of Hezbollah, and as they quietly thanked Allah for Bibi Netanyahu and President Trump for degrading Iran. So what we're actually experiencing in parallel here is really unprecedented. More and more of the, because Hamas will be physically defeated, but their ideology is now out. Remember, you and I spoke way back when, I think it was uh, with the ice cream, with SodaStream, the
Yes,
early parts of BDS. No, we're not against Israel. We're certainly not against. It's just the West Bank and the Green Line, and today BDS is an anti-Semitic movement and one that wants to also punish anyone doing business with Israel. It's straight out of the 20th century guidebook to how apartheid South Africa was taken down. We're seeing these similar steps, step by step. And on top of all of that, we have social media 24/7. I travel a lot in the region, in the Maghreb and in the Gulf. And I watch a lot of Al Jazeera English. It is straight hatred of Israel, frankly, of the Jewish people, and doesn't think very kindly of America either. It is when you are fed that 24/7, when BBC, the New York Times, and the Washington Post become the sounding boards for Hamas, even as they're militarily defeated and they are uh, doing horrible things to our hostages. So when you take that all together and you just look at the average person to get together with demographic realities, we seem to be entering a potential era of expanded relations between the Arab Muslim world and the state of Israel, at least during the this administration, on the one hand, and the continued demonization and isolation of Israel, and right along with that, with the Jewish population in each of those countries being really unable on its own to deal with the tsunami of hate on the streets, online, in the newspapers, in the halls of diplomacy and power.
All of this comes at the same time. The Palestinian Authority, Mahmoud Abbas, they are now saying, oh, we would love to have, they're not saying that they want to live side by side with Israel in peace and cooperation, and everything would be lovely and wonderful. This is what they're saying now. At the same time, we see what's going on with
Right.
Hamas.
So without being too snarky, because it's difficult not to when you talk about Abbas and the PA, but if you want to talk on a practical, objective level, if the Palestinian Authority is interested in communicating to Israeli citizens, their neighbors, and to the Jewish world that they're serious about peace and they actually control anything going on in the Palestinian territories, number one, get rid of pay to slay. Number two, change immediately your entire curriculum, which doesn't recognize the reality of Israel, which teaches kids to emulate and hold up as heroes suicide bombers, and to essentially deny the legitimacy of their neighbors and deny the reality of the state of Israel. And that is what's being taught to little kids from K through 12. And we see the results, what they do during summer camp and all the rest. And and we also see the harsh reality. I hope history will prove us wrong. But as far as I know, we don't have a single case of a person in Gaza of any age, male or female, in any way, shape, or form trying to ameliorate the suffering of hostages. Not one example. Not one. We're over 600 days into this horror. And so you have a society essentially that's been brought up in the generations of brainwashing. And by the way, the PA and Hamas use the same curriculum. So when you're saying, it's sort of like, you have a great wedding plan. First of all, you got Uncle Sam with deep pockets. He's going to pay for the chasana. You got Israel, and the question is, so where's the bride? Who's the bride? And that really has been the sticking issue. And while hypocritical European leaders can talk about two-state solution, that's over for a long time. The Jewish people, and especially led by our brothers and sisters in the state of Israel, they're not going to buy that right now. They're not going to, people should take a look and do the math of what it means that 1,200 Israelis were butchered in one day. How many Americans, how many tens of thousands of Americans would that be? You have almost 1,000 Israeli dead soldiers and many who lost limbs. Transpose that, God forbid, if America had to look at such statistics. It's overwhelming. So I'm not surprised. I'm alarmed, but not surprised that when the truth is systematically suppressed by the very legacy media been brought up to trust, and with social media, being able to take the various pictures of kids with cerebral palsy or kids who got killed during the Syrian civil war, or whatever it is they have to do to indict the state of Israel and the Jewish people with a blood libel. That's what we are currently suffering. And one other point, I'm going to be doing on Thursday a webinar with Reverend Johnny Moore, who's the head of the Gaza Humanitarian Fund, that has managed in 2 months to feed 100 million meals to Gazans, cutting out the mafia known as Hamas. cutting out the middleman, for which you have a global campaign to demonize and get rid of that foundation, led by the United Nations. So, for anybody who wants to look at things objectively, you're going to come to to one conclusion. But when you see, like, why did the UN take all of that food and all of those trucks and bring it into Gaza and walk away? Why? Because the game plan was to point to that food as saying, we tried, it was impossible to deliver. The occupying force, that's Israel. They're responsible that the people who were suffering, and they are suffering in many places, especially the weaker, the poorer, it's all Israel's fault. So they are guilty of starvation, of not giving water, whatever it is. All of that was to build up the credentials for more actions at the ICJ, the ICC, the UN General Assembly, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Unfortunately for them, you had this group, the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. They exposed it. They exposed the lie. So anyone who's going to get in the way of this juggernaut, watch out. You're going to feel this thing. But we have to find and work with the people who are interested in the truth and people who really want to help the suffering people in Gaza.
You know, you mentioned the Israeli hostages, 50 of the Israeli hostages still being held. A year ago, September of last year, you wrote to the International Committee of the Red Cross and you said, do something, go in there, visit the hostages, provide them with medical treatment. What kind of a response have you gotten?
No response.
No.
We have tried with some of the other committees, including one in Europe. But I see now, understandably, that the Prime Minister Netanyahu the other day made a direct public plea after the release of that horrific video
Yes.
for them to get in there, to at least make the effort to get in there. But I have to say that when you look at what has been going on, and when it comes to some of those international agencies, it's almost like playing Chinese checkers. The guy gets exposed in one institution. Okay, so we'll take him from UNRWA, we'll put him into the RC, and vice versa. It makes no difference if there's corruption, if there are other issues. There is a juggernaut of the very caretakers of civil society that have bought into or been bought, hard to say how and why, into a game plan where demonizing, dehumanizing, and eventually getting rid of Israel is the underlying goal. There is no other explanation for this.
Right.
And what we have to do is, I think, whatever you think of the Republican Democrat divide in the United States, and everything is weaponized on both sides. It's hard to have. This is an issue where we need to work with whomever is going to step forward. I'm sorry that right now it looks like it's Senator Fetterman and maybe Richard Tories against the world and Democrats. But right now, we have an administration that, when it comes to Israel and the fight against anti-Semitism, for whatever reason they got to where they're at, they are trying, they are doing, and I think that people who are supporters of Israel, again, whichever government they have and whatever the configuration is, make no mistake, Israel's in an existential battle. And, it is absolutely amazing, our first conversation after October 7th, where everyone was worried that now the Arabs would gang up on Israel. Well, Israel's taught a bit of a lesson, and including the non-Arab Iranian regime. So their military deterrence has been not only restored, but greatly enhanced. But on the other playing field, which is the halls of diplomacy, uh, the polls that are coming out, I would say the willful uh, uh, involvement of key people at places like the New York Times and the Washington Post, the BBC, Sky News, can go on and on and on, Deutsche Welle. This stuff doesn't happen overnight, and we're not going to win that war overnight, but we pray for the return of our hostages. We pray for some semblance of normalcy, and then we have to roll up our sleeves collectively and fight the other beast.
Let me ask you, about a year ago, I guess it was, or maybe a little more, you were quite critical of Pope Francis for, quote, abandoning the Jews and for calling for a ceasefire just days after October 7th. Now Pope Leo the 14th is in the Vatican. Have you had a chance to interact with him at all?
I'm looking forward to visiting Pope Leo if he'll see me. I think he's supposed to be a tolerant guy leading a tolerant church. I was with the previous Pope on 4 different occasions, including once in Bahrain. He was, in his way, courageous, outspoken. He was not in good shape physically in the last months of his life. I'm not sure who it was that had his ear, but that he spent an inordinate amount of time speaking to a tiny church in Gaza over and over and over again. And I think in the final months of his life, that largely shaped his public persona on the Middle East. He did meet with some of the families of the hostages, I think earlier. But at the end of the day, his statements, which stayed focused, if you will, kind of a narrowcast, turned out to be, I think, very harmful to the cause. As far as Pope Leo, you have also now the recent partial shelling of the grounds of a church a Catholic church in Gaza, and you have
Israel said that was a mistake. Yeah,
correct. And they mistake. They apologized, but it happened, and that generated its own 2 weeks of headlines in the Catholic and Christian world. And the number one Catholic representative's name is Pete Sabella. I knew him when he was his job was to look after the real estate of the church in Israel and on the West Bank. Italian gentleman. I found them to be, back in those days, very balanced. Now that he's the number one person, you hear a much sharper focus on condemning Israel. That seems to be the overall scheme of things. And again, as I look at it, and where I'll be focusing most of my attentions in coming months, and hopefully, please God, a few years, is to build on the momentum of the Abraham Accords and to try to tamp down anti-Semitism from within the Arab and Muslim world. To do that, that includes places like Pakistan, like Saudi Arabia, which has changed in many ways. But I think in the area where we have to start, basics, and that's with education. And we have to replace stereotypes with whom we are, and also what are our values.
I appreciate it. Listen, this has been a fast half hour. Thank you so much, Rabbi Abraham Cooper. He's the Associate Dean and Director of Global Social Action for the Simon Wiesenthal Center in Los Angeles. Thanks so much again. Great to see you again. Until
Thank
next
you,
week.
Stewart.
Thank you. Until next week, this has been Jewish Life. Until then, have a good week.